Generation Z did not invent quiet quitting. Xennials built the system that made it inevitable. And if that sentence just made you angry, from either side, good. That anger is information. Stay with it. Today we are going to do something most work culture conversations refuse to do. We are going to tell both sides of the truth. Not the comfortable version of either truth, the full version, the version with no heroes and no villains. This video is not about who is lazy. It is not about which generation has better values. It is about how a broken system got built, who built it, why they built it, what it cost, and why the people dismantling it are not the problem. Even when the dismantling is messy. Stay with me. This one is going to challenge you regardless of which side of 1990 you were born on. Before we go anywhere, we need to destroy the most common myth about hustle culture. The myth is that it was built by ambitious people who loved working. People who woke up energized by the grind. People who chose the 70-hour week because they genuinely wanted it. Hustle culture was built by frightened people, specifically by a generation that entered the workforce during or immediately after the 2001 economic contraction, watched their peers lose jobs they thought were safe, and encoded one lesson into their psychology so deeply it became a personality trait: visibility equals survival. Here is the psychological mechanism. When a behavior saves you during a crisis, and working harder than everyone around you, arriving earliest, staying latest, absorbing extra responsibility, the behavior does not just become a habit, it becomes identity. The brain files it under, "This is who I am, not just what I did." Then 2008, the financial crisis hit Xennials in their prime building years, late 20s, early 30s. The people who kept their jobs were almost exclusively the ones who had made themselves irreplaceable through volume of effort and constant availability. The people with boundaries were often the first to go. The lesson was reinforced with brutal efficiency. Security costs everything. So by the time Xennials reached positions of genuine influence, managing teams, running departments, shaping company culture, they carried 15 years of a single reinforced belief: the cost of security is yourself. And they built cultures that reflected that belief, not because they were cruel, but because they genuinely believed it was the only map that worked. That culture became the water that Generation Z was born swimming in. They did not choose it. They did not ask for it. They arrived in a workplace where the rules had been written by people whose trauma required those rules, and they were handed the rules without any of the trauma that made the rules make sense. Now the other side. Because Generation Z's relationship with work is one of the most consistently misread stories in contemporary culture, and the misreading is doing real damage to real people in real organizations every single day. Generation Z grew up watching. They watched their parents, many of whom were Xennials, exhaust themselves for companies that restructured them out of existence anyway. They watched loyalty rewarded with layoffs. They watched people sacrifice their health, their marriages, their presence in their own children's lives for a stability that turned out to be temporary. Generation Z is also the first generation to enter the workforce with access to real-time, publicly available research on the outcomes of overwork. They read the burnout studies before their first performance review. They process the data on chronic stress pathology before they signed their first employment contract. They came in informed, and the information was not flattering to the system they were entering. When Generation Z says they will not answer emails at midnight, they are not failing to care about the job. They are refusing to repeat an experiment whose results are already published. When they say their identity is not their job title, they are not being nihilistic. They watched what happened to the people whose identity was their job title when the company decided they were redundant. And here is what the Xennial side almost never acknowledges. Generation Z's rejection of hustle culture is not the problem. It is a rational response to a documented failure. The problem, and this is where both sides need to stay honest, is that some of what emerged in place of hustle culture has its own blind spots. And those blind spots deserve to be named. Quiet quitting, the practice of doing exactly your job description and nothing beyond it, is a psychologically valid response to exploitation. Let me say that clearly before I say anything else. If you are being exploited, withdrawing your discretionary effort is a legitimate form of self-protection. That is not under discussion here. What is under discussion is what happens when quiet quitting becomes a default operating mode rather than a response to a specific injustice. When the minimum becomes the standard regardless of circumstances, when the philosophy outlives the condition that made it necessary. Because when that happens, three specific psychological costs appear. First cost, skill stagnation. This one is rarely discussed because it sounds like a corporate talking point, but it is not a corporate talking point. It is a neuroscience fact. Growth, professional and cognitive, happens almost exclusively at the edge of your current capacity, not inside it. The minimum keeps you inside it, always. Second cost, the invisible professional network. The colleagues who become sponsors, who advocate for you in rooms you are not in, who recommend you for opportunities before you know they exist, they almost never come from your contracted hours. They come from the unscripted moments. The conversation after the meeting. The problem you were not required to help with but did. Quiet quitting makes those moments structurally impossible. And the cost of that appears years later, when you are looking for opportunities and finding that the doors are not where you expected them. Third cost, the one that is hardest to argue against and most important to name, meaning erosion. Human beings are not wired to find meaning in minimum viable effort. They are wired to find meaning in contribution that matters, in building something that lasts, in being part of something larger than their individual task list. When work becomes a purely transactional exchange, hours for money, nothing more, that source of meaning evacuates. And meaning does not politely wait until after work hours to make itself missed. Now the part that Xennials in positions of leadership need to hear, not because they are villains, because they are often the ones with the actual power to change the environment, and most of them have not used it yet. Hustle culture, regardless of how it was built, and why it made sense to the people who built it. Produced, documented, measurable harm. Burnout rates in knowledge workers doubled between 2010 and 2020. Chronic, stress-related illness became the leading category of worker compensation claims in the United States. Productivity research consistently shows that output quality begins declining sharply after 50 hours of work per week, and continues declining from there. Xennials also built cultures that systematically rewarded presence over output. The metric was visibility, not productivity. The person who was seen at their desk the longest was assumed to be working the hardest. This rewarded people whose personal circumstances allowed for unlimited availability, and penalized people with health needs, family responsibilities, or simply the efficiency to complete the work in less time. And the most consequential error, the one Xennials almost never acknowledge, because it requires admitting something uncomfortable about their own psychology, is this: they transmitted the demands of hustle culture to the next generation without transmitting the context that made those demands temporarily rational. They passed on the rules without the reasons, and a rule without a reason is not guidance, it is dogma. Generation Z was right to question rules without reasons. That is not a character flaw. That is a functioning critical mind operating correctly. The failure was not in the questioning. The failure was in the system that expected compliance without explanation. Here is the deepest psychological wound in this entire conversation, and it belongs to both generations equally. The wound is this: both Xennials and Generation Z have, in different ways, made work the measure of their worth, and both versions of that mistake are costing them. For Xennials, the identity trap looks like this: my worth is equal to my productivity. If I produce, I matter. If I rest, I disappear. This is why so many Xennials cannot take a vacation without checking their email, cannot leave work at work, cannot receive the question, "So what do you do?" without feeling that their answer determines their value as a human being. For Generation Z, the identity trap looks like this: my worth is equal to my resistance. My value as a person is demonstrated by how clearly I refuse to let work define me. And this is also an identity built around work, just a negative one. You are still spending enormous psychological energy in relation to work. You are just spending it in opposition rather than in investment. The center of gravity is the same. Both traps produce the same outcome: a person whose sense of self is structurally dependent on something external and unstable. For Xennials, that external thing is their job. For Generation Z, it is their relationship to their job. When the job changes, and all jobs change, both identities become unstable at the root. Here is what decades of performance research actually shows. Not what sounds good in a LinkedIn post, not what feels intuitively right to either generation, what the controlled studies replicated across multiple fields and cultures actually demonstrate about sustainable high performance. First, focused intensity followed by full recovery consistently outperforms sustained medium effort, not slightly outperforms. Significantly, athletes have known this for 50 years. Organizations are only beginning to apply it. The person who gives everything for 6 focused hours and then completely stops generates more output at higher quality than the person who gives 70% for 12 hours every time. The data is not ambiguous. Second, autonomy over method consistently increases both output quality and retention. When workers control how they accomplish their work, not what they accomplish or by when, but how, the results improve measurably. This is documented across decades of organizational psychology. Hustle culture removed autonomy in the name of productivity. It achieved the opposite of its stated goal. Third, meaning and contribution are not soft factors. They are measurable performance variables. Workers who understand why their work matters beyond their personal compensation produce at measurably higher levels than those who do not. This does not require a profound mission statement or a values document. It requires someone in authority to explain, specifically and honestly, how this person's work connects to something that matters to someone. That conversation takes 15 minutes. Most managers have never had it. Now the practical section, not the feel-good version. The actual, specific, uncomfortable things that each generation needs to offer the other if this conversation is going to produce something more than a standoff. What Xennials owe Generation Z? Context. The explanation that was never given. Not a justification of hustle culture. It does not need to be justified, and the attempt to justify it will fail. The explanation of where it came from, what it was built from, what it cost the people who built it. Because when Generation Z understands that hustle culture was born from survival fear and not from contempt for work-life balance, their relationship to the Xennials who embody it changes. You cannot change the culture by demanding compliance. You can change it by sharing the human story behind it. What Generation Z owes Xennials? Investment that is visible, not 70-hour weeks, not the sacrifice of health and relationships, but the visible signal that the work matters to them, that they are present in it, that their contribution is real and sustained, not the minimum required to avoid being let go. Xennials read disengagement as contempt, and sometimes they are correct to read it that way. The distinction between principled protection of one's humanity and simple apathy matters, and it matters that Generation Z makes that distinction visible through their actual engagement with the work, and what both generations owe each other, the honest acknowledgement that the broken system was built by the circumstances they each inherited, not by each other. Xennials did not choose the recessions that shaped them. Generation Z did not choose the hustle culture they were born into. Both generations are trying to navigate a world they did not design. The anger between them is misdirected. The actual target is the systemic conditions that put both groups inside an impossible frame. I want to give you something specific. Not a value statement, not a vision. A description of what the repaired work culture actually looks like in the places where it exists, because it does exist, and the organizations where it exists are outperforming the ones still running the old model. It looks like output measured by results, not by hours. The Xennial manager who stops tracking when people arrive and starts tracking what they deliver. The Generation Z worker who stops tracking how little they can do and starts tracking what they have actually built. Both recalibrations are required. Neither happens first. They happen simultaneously or they do not happen. It looks like recovery treated as strategy, not laziness. The manager who says, "Take the long weekend. You have been running hard and I need you sharp next month, not depleted next week." The worker who takes the long weekend fully and returns fully, not half present for 2 weeks as a substitute for 3 days of real recovery. The recovery is the investment. Treating it as laziness is the error that costs everyone. It looks like honest conversations about meaning that are not manufactured, not a town hall about the company vision. A manager sitting with an individual asking, "What part of your work do you find genuinely interesting? What would make this role feel worth your best effort?" Not as a retention strategy, as a genuine inquiry that the manager is prepared to act on. The generation that grew up having their authenticity demanded online, Generation Z, can detect manufactured sincerity in 3 seconds. Do not perform this conversation. Have it. Let me end where we began, with the accusation. Generation Z did not invent quiet quitting. Xennials built the system that made it inevitable. Both of those things remain true. But here is what is also true. The system that made quiet quitting inevitable was itself built by people who were trying to survive, not by people who wanted to harm the people who came after them. The Xennial who built hustle culture and the member of Generation Z who is dismantling it are not enemies. They are two people who received different broken versions of the same promise, that if you do the right things, work will reward you proportionately. Both promises were partially false. Both groups are right to be frustrated. They are frustrated at the wrong target. The repair does not happen in a policy document or a generational think piece. It happens in the small decisions. The manager who sends a message on Friday afternoon, "Great work this week. Do not think about this until Monday." The worker who stays 20 extra minutes not because they are required to, but because the work matters to them today. Small, voluntary, uncoerced, both directions. This is how cultures actually change. If this video describes something you have lived, from either side of the generational line, drop the word fixed in the comments. Not because work is fixed, because you are choosing to see it more clearly. And seeing it clearly is always, always, always where the fixing starts. Subscribe if you want to keep going. This channel exists for anyone who wants to understand the systems shaping their life, not just feel shaped by them. Next video, why Xennial brains are stuck in 1997 and why that is not weakness. It is a completely different register from today. Quieter, more internal, same generation, different wound. See you there. Peace.